Good evening, friends. I'm Reverend Vanessa Rose. I'm the pastor here at First Church. On behalf of my colleagues, the deacons, and the members of First Church, but in particular on behalf of the Working for Racial Justice team here, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you. There are so many wonderful things you could have chosen to do in Fairfield on a Friday night, and the fact that you chose this event speaks volumes about what you all value. I want to welcome our speaker, Alec Lurie, and thank him for bringing such a wealth of knowledge to us. And I want to offer a special welcome to any of you who are visitors who have never been here to First Church. We want you to know that we are a church that respects, admires, and appreciates other faith traditions and affirms the dignity of all people. We are always saying here, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here, and we really mean that. We hope you will feel comfortable in this place. This room is often called the Meeting House because since 1639, the church has been honored to provide a place for the people of the town to gather, not just for worship, but also for educational opportunities and connection. This event is coming at a historic milestone for the church and the town, which will be 385 years old this year. At our 375th anniversary, the church did some historical work around acknowledging that our history begins with the stealing of lives and land and the erasure of the peoples of the Pequannock and Paugussett nations, who lived here for countless centuries prior, who called this place Unkaway. For our 385th anniversary, it is again time to reflect on another shadow side of our history. This conversation is taking place, as you know, in a time when there are many who want to deny the reality of history and who pretend that the most patriotic thing we can do is to pretend that we have always lived up to our highest ideals as a nation. I believe that, on the contrary, the most patriotic thing we can do is not to be afraid of the truth of the past or the present, not be afraid or ashamed to take an honest look at our collective past, to learn from it, and to move forward in ways that affirm the dignity of all people. In a moment, one of the leaders of the Working for Racial Justice team, Rita Skog, will explain more about how we came to this topic. But I want you to know that the Working for Racial Justice team has put in careful work to balance the educational components and reflective opportunities with taking action for social justice in our state. This event is part of a multifaceted approach to that working for racial justice. So this is not a simple one-off lecture, but part of a years-long project, a pathway, we call it at the church, to learn about the past, to grow as individuals, and to work for a more just world for the future. And now it is my honor to welcome our first selectman, Bill Gerber. I want to thank you for the ways you have already, in such a short amount of time, shown your commitment to supporting town-wide efforts to work for racial justice. First Selectman Gerber, we are glad to have you as our neighbor across the street at the town hall. We look forward to planning a wonderful Juneteenth celebration together and continuing to work together to make Fairfield an example to Connecticut and the country of what it can mean to be a community striving to be a place of belonging for everyone. And we are grateful to you for being willing to share a few words with us tonight. Thank you.
I can't follow that. Can I just say what she said, and then, well, we've started some work, and we are having a Juneteenth celebration, and hopefully you will all come and participate. It's going to be at Town Hall and on the Green, and but we haven't really in earnest begun, the work. We have a lot to do, and we're thinking very hard about how to do it, and we don't want to mess it up. We want to do it the right way. So, and hopefully, this community will help us, because we're going to need volunteers. I was just talking with Jackie Page prior to coming up here, and she said, yeah, there was a survey done, and they found out that in Connecticut, eighth graders didn't know that there was slavery in Connecticut. Not just eighth graders, most people in Connecticut don't know there was slavery in Connecticut. And one of the reasons that I know we have slavery in Connecticut is because of this young man here who wrote a lot of art. Alec Lurie wrote a lot of articles, and he was published in the Connecticut Mirror and in Connecticut Post. When I grew up outside of Philadelphia, I never knew there was slavery in New England until recently. And in Fairfield, I guess we were one of the greatest offenders in New England. I believe you wrote 1 in 7 households owned slaves, or at least I read that somewhere. And it just reminds me of the past several years. It's been a process. I forget how long ago, watching a show on television called Watchmen, and there was this race riot going on in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I turned to my wife and I said, "Did that happen?" And she said, "Yep, that happened." I looked it up. Never heard of it. Never learned that in school. So Wilmington, North Carolina, never learned about Wilmington in school. So the study of history and the historians who are willing to spend, their time uncovering, doing the hard work and bringing this to light, I just so grateful for that. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Unfortunately, I can't stay. I have a cancer fundraiser that's going on right now. I've got to hightail it up to New Haven, but thanks for inviting me, Vanessa. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Wendy Williams Brown, the Senior Deacon for First Church Fairfield. Can you please join me in prayer? Will you please stand if you're able? Let us pray. Heavenly Father of compassion and mercy, you have set the captive free. Your spirit search restlessly for those who were and are victims of slave. Your words show that you have brought joy and hope where previously there were only shame and fear. You said in your words, those you have set free are free indeed. Your Son came to bring good news to the poor and the oppressed, exclaiming freedom. May we be the voice against captivity, a voice of freedom, and may our eyes be open wide to all those who suffered physically and emotionally. Help us to walk away tonight understanding, remember of the stone meant to this community. And please help us heal. In your name we pray. Amen.
Good evening. My name is Rita Skog. I'm one of the deacons here at First Church. I'm also on the Working for Racial Justice Committee. I was asked to answer the question, why is the Remembrance Stones project important? Why undertake this now? First Church Fairfield's Working for Racial Justice pathway grew out of the injustices and inequities we saw our siblings of color subjected to. We believed that as Christians, we had to witness to the reality of white supremacy in both our church and our society. We also had to take action. It is the role of the church to educate and provide consciousness-raising opportunities for members of First Church and the community. Our goal is lofty. It is to become an anti-racist church, community, and nation. But first, we need to look inward. As individuals and as a congregation, what do we know about racism, biases, or our past? How do we feel and act as individuals around these topics? Over the past several years, we have provided opportunities for enlightened studies, stimulating discussions, and reflection. Once we discovered that the early clergy of First Church enslaved individuals, the Pathway team wanted to learn more. In learning more, we felt moved to unerase, name if possible, claim as siblings, and remember those people, mostly of African origin, but also Native peoples, who served this congregation and were part of the community, but not by choice. We feel it's time for us to own our past, not with guilt, but with reverence, remembering and honoring the lives of those who toiled on farms, shipyards, and in homes on behalf of this congregation and helped Fairfield and First Church to become the community it is today. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jackie Page, and I am a member also of the Racial Justice Pathway at the church. And it's my pleasure to introduce Alec Lurie. His bio is in the handout that we had for you, but I want to make it clear that we were so excited to find him, that here is someone who spent the last 7 years building a database of the enslaved people in Fairfield. And so it was just such a fit and so exciting to actually find someone that was addressing this. So I think you'll really love his presentation, and I present to you Alec Lurie.
So this is kind of strange for me. I've never been in front of a church before. So very, very different kind of presentation. But thank you all for having me and for those lovely introductions. So before I get into sort of the nitty-gritty of this history, I wanted to talk to you about how this all began, because I really wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Dr. Vincent Rosovac, who is a professor at Fairfield University. In 2017, I sort of just jumped at an unusual opportunity and bit off a little bit more than I could chew. The professor was doing research on slavery in the town of Fairfield, and I just decided, sure, I would take part in it. I had absolutely no idea what that would entail, if I could help in any way, if I'd be sweeping floors or going through the probate court. It turned out I was going through the probate court. And I got very, very invested in this project. The goal really was to identify as many enslaved people in the town of Fairfield as possible. Know their names, connect them to their family relations, and basically reconstruct their family trees. So Dr. Vincent Rosovac had been working with this data for 20 plus years at this point, just sort of casually, off to the side. It wasn't his main area of expertise. And he had amassed thousands and thousands of records recording enslaved people and the enslavers who owned them. And I was basically just enthralled. I couldn't keep myself from digging and digging and digging into this information because it struck me that no one knew about this. You know, I would walk down the streets in Fairfield and I would constantly be thinking that these enslaved people were walking the same streets just a few hundred years ago. And unfortunately, in the middle of this, Dr. Rosovac very suddenly passed away. And with my research partner, Olivia, we decided to continue this work and bring his vision to fruition. So we decided to create a database of all of these enslaved people and their family relations. That database, until recently, was hosted at Fairfield University, and now, with the gracious support of the Fairfield Museum, is going to be revamped and redesigned here for the public to view free of charge at the Fairfield Museum with the support of Connecticut Humanities as well as the Yale Beinecke Library. So I don't really remember a time when I've had to explain what slavery is, but it seems like we've gotten to that point because In the last couple of years or so, there's been some debate over what slavery means. So I'm going to be talking about slavery in the American context, because that's really the kind of slavery that we're familiar with and that we really need to acquaint ourselves with. First and foremost, it's a system of labor that is forced and uncompensated. These are the two biggest differences from servitude. So with indentured servitude, it's a contract, and there is some form of compensation given either at the very beginning of servitude or at the very end. This is not the case with slavery. In the Americas, at least, this is also called chattel slavery, what we have here. Chattel slavery means that an enslaved person is no longer a legal human being. They are the property of the person that owns them. They can be bought, they can be sold, they can be given to heirs, etc. This is kind of different from how slavery is traditionally seen historically. Slavery goes back thousands of years, but chattel slavery is a newer version of this institution. And lastly, in the Americas, it is racialized. So you would be very hard-pressed to find slavery in the Americas that is not imposed specifically on Native or Black people through a system of inheritance. It's inherited through the mother in a system which is basically referred to as the child shall follow in the condition of the mother. There's a Latin phrase for it, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. That's basically the kind of slavery that we're looking at today. So here is what the state of Connecticut looked like in 1774. Now, there was a 1774 census done that essentially just showed who was living in the state. There were no names, there was no legal status attached, just ages, sex, and race. And these are the numbers that came out of that. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, you're going to hear me use the word Negro. I use that in the historical sense. This is the way in which people were described at the time. And so in order to keep a sense of accuracy, I also use that term when referring to enslaved people. In 1774, they counted up how many white people and how many quote-unquote Negro people were in the state, and they came up with these numbers. As you can see, there is a sort of trend line. Closer to the shore, you have higher percentages of Black, Negro, mulatto people. This does not necessarily mean that they were enslaved, but given that 1774 is the peak of slavery in Connecticut, it's a pretty good guess that most of these individuals are enslaved. This sort of makes some sense, though. So, closer to the water, you have flatter land. It's better for farming. You also have easier access to trade routes. This is kind of the story of these coastal towns. This is how they became wealthy in the first place. So it's no great surprise that you see an increased number of enslaved people at the shore. But this doesn't really tell the whole story. If we come down to the county level and we take a look just at Fairfield, we see that there are some trends even within specific counties. So here you see that Fairfield and Stratford, which is mostly Bridgeport at this point, currently, has the highest percentage of enslaved people, 6%. That doesn't sound like a lot, but I promise you, it really is. 6% of anything is noticeable. This, again, makes some degree of sense, because Fairfield historically is a very wealthy town, and wealth and slavery went hand in hand. For reference, this is 1774. This is the Black population then. Today in Fairfield, the Black population is less than 2%. The highest number, the highest percentage of people of color in the town of Fairfield were here when slavery was at its peak. I'm not going to go too in-depth into this timeline, but I think it's worth considering for a second. So you probably can't see the numbers, but the main gist of this is that slavery in Connecticut basically began almost as soon as Connecticut began. The first record of an enslaved person in the colony of Connecticut is 1639. And as many of you probably know, Connecticut was founded 1635, 1636, depending on who you ask. Additionally, slavery is not that far gone. Slavery lasted until 1848 in Connecticut. That's just 13 years before the beginning of the Civil War. For my purposes, I'm going to stick to that pink bar there, which really talks about 1700 to 1800s. That's the main wave of enslaved people. But I think it's worth knowing that Connecticut has a longer history with slavery than without. And when that will finally equal out is 2060. So what did enslaved labor look like in the North? Now, there were a few different forms of slavery that were particularly prevalent here in Fairfield and in Fairfield County and the North more broadly. The most common was subsistence farming. There was small-scale farmers who had a mixed labor force, typically. It was usually just a father, a mother, some children, perhaps some paid servants, perhaps some indentured servants, and maybe one or two enslaved people. And their labor was basically just shadowing the labor of the enslaver. But what people really don't understand is that there was another form of slavery going on here that is referred to generally as provisioning plantations. Plantations, that word should ring a bell from the South. And it's because this is a connected concept. Provisioning plantations were essentially large-scale farms where they were growing wheat and harvesting apples and raising cattle specifically to transfer them to the South and to the West Indies, which had used up all of their land on sugar, cotton, and tobacco. They simply didn't have enough land to produce the things that they needed to keep them alive. And so New England was the primary supplier of these sorts of goods. On these provisioning plantations, you often had between 10 to 15 enslaved people, and there was a clear distinction between the enslaved and the enslaver. Furthermore, there was also a good deal of trades in the town of Fairfield and the North generally. This, very much like subsistence farming, is sort of a shadow industry. You have enslaved people basically doing the same sort of work that the enslaver is doing, whether they're a blacksmith or a carpenter, or in this particular case, working in a church. You would have had these particular enslaved people doing ancillary tasks. And then lastly, something that gets kind of overlooked is the labor of enslaved women. Thousands of enslaved women and children were in enslaved domestic labor. They were working in the household, doing some incredibly arduous tasks, including laundry, mending clothing, caring for children. All of those things that perhaps an enslaver wouldn't want to do. And forgot to mention, I put these houses up here as an example. So on the top left, you have Burr Mansion. This is an example of a home that was owned by a politician and a sheriff. This is the kind of life that was one of luxury and wealth, and you would have enslaved people mostly in roles of domestic servants in this kind of a household. Thaddeus Burr did, in fact, own slaves. On the top right, you have the Gold Selig Silliman House. He was a Continental Army general, and his wife, Mary Silliman, you may have heard of, she sort of owned this large farm after her husband died, and they had at least 11 enslaved people. And their home was directly connected to the West Indian trade. They were producing goods specifically to supply these plantations that were so focused on growing sugar. What I find particularly interesting about the Silliman home, though, is that if you're from Fairfield, you probably know the name of what this plantation was called. It was called Holland Hill. On the bottom left, we have Samuel Penfield's Sun Tavern. He, as you could probably guess, was a tavern keeper. And so he had enslaved people, serving the various people who would come in and stay the night. He also had a printing business out of his house. This was pretty typical. There's this saying that enslaved people of the North were jacks of all trades, and that really is the case. And lastly, I want to show you a picture of the Ogden House. Now, there's no direct evidence that anyone was ever enslaved at Ogden House, which is now owned and operated by the Fairfield Museum. David Ogden was a pretty small-scale farmer. He lived a yeoman's life. But as I was doing this research, I found something very telling in his estate records. No enslaved people, but iron fetters. Another name for that, handcuffs. I don't know of a circumstance outside of being a jailer or some member of law enforcement why you would have iron fetters. And yes, that is the only interpretation of iron fetters, handcuffs. And lastly, I want to talk about the misconceptions about slavery in the North. These are probably things that you've heard frequently. Slavery in the North was less severe than it was in the South, that it wasn't as economically significant as it was in the South, that there was some sort of equality between people of color and white people in the North. These are all lies. Enslaved labor was incredibly brutal. Even if the labor itself was not particularly grueling, people were still being separated from their families on a daily basis and sold as human property. But I want to direct your attention to that newspaper article up on the top left. I know you can't see it. But this is a story that was published in newspaper in 1771 about a 14-year-old boy enslaved here in the town of Fairfield. And he was punished for some alleged wrongdoing, and he decided to retaliate. And he burned down the barn of the person who owned him. The person who owned him, whose name is redacted in this newspaper article, decided to have him whipped publicly right out here on the town green and then sold into the West Indian slave plantations. 14 years old. Now, I find this story quite interesting because I was actually able to figure out who the enslaver in this circumstance was. It was a man by the name of Jonathan Bulkley. Jonathan Bulkley owned a tavern, which is basically a stone's throw away from where we're sitting right now. Slavery was in no way gentle, ever. Secondly, people talk about how slavery wasn't really important to the North's economy. This also, complete lie. Remember, 6% of the town of Fairfield is likely being enslaved. 6% of anything is a large number. If 6% of people in the town of Fairfield today walked off the job, we would have a problem. 6% unemployment, that's a problem. 6% of your population as human chattel, that's pretty significant. Additionally, they were doing work that was supporting this system of slavery that was throughout the Americas. And then very lastly, the idea that there was some sort of equality. This is particularly troubling to me because it's quite a distortion of the history of Connecticut, the history of Fairfield. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about a few laws of the 19th century, the 1800s, after slavery was pretty much gone from the state. In 1818, black people were specifically barred from voting in the state of Connecticut. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, called Connecticut the Georgia of New England, a free state, the Georgia of New England. And then lastly, you'll probably recognize some of the names I mentioned. Connecticut was home to a very supportive community for the Colonization Society. Now, the Colonization Society had basically one goal. They wanted to deport free black people and send them to Africa so that they wouldn't be a burden on the rest of white society. Two presidents of the Connecticut Colonization Society actually have schools in the town of Fairfield named after them: Roger Minot Sherman and Gideon Tomlinson. This history spans way beyond slavery, and in no way was there equality in this state before or after the introduction of this system. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our first presenter.
Oh, Alec, thank you. Thus far, thank you. Good evening. My name is Catherine Lee. I am on the racial justice team at First Church Congregational. Reverend Samuel Wakeman, as an early New England Protestant minister, identified as a Puritan, and the Puritan legacy has evolved as Congregationalism. First Church Congregational, the first church in Fairfield, was established, as Vanessa said, in 1639. Reverend John Jones, educated at Cambridge University, England, was the first ordained minister, serving for 20 years. The year before his death, Reverend Jones was assisted by Samuel Wakeman. You're about to hear that the four pastors highlighted this evening attended Harvard. This wasn't happenstance. In 1636, the leaders of Massachusetts Bay Colony, a slaveholding colony, founded the college to ensure a literate ministry. John Harvard, another of the numerous graduates of Cambridge University, England, emigrated with his wife in 1637. The young pastor Harvard, dying childless a year later, bequeathed considerable funds as well as his significant library to this new institution. The leaders honored his gift and memory by giving the college his name. The Reverend Samuel Wakeman, our second pastor, was born in 1635, the son of John Wakeman and Elizabeth Hopkins Wakeman. The parents emigrated and settled in the New Haven colony, where Samuel was raised. He attended Harvard College, but left without graduating in 1655. Samuel married Hannah Goodyear in 1656. They moved to Fairfield subsequently, with at least the first of their 8 children. Upon ordination, Wakeman began his ministry in 1665. He would oversee the building of the second sanctuary in 1668. Now, he has been described as a lover of books with an impressive, valuable library, a teacher, a prosperous farmer, a businessman, and a widely influential community counselor. He received a land grant of 200 acres in 1673 Fairfield, Southport, and Westport residents will not be surprised that Reverend Wakeman ultimately held extensive real estate property in several areas within the boundaries of early historic Fairfield. Reverend Wakeman was reputed to be an aggressive preacher. His election sermon in Hartford lasted all day, excepting the lunch hour. One archived sermon is entitled, "Sound Repentance, the Right Way to Escape Deserved Ruin." Reverend Wakeman was considered tolerant at the time, allowing church membership to those who might not agree with all the articles of faith and church discipline, but would, quote, own the covenant, believe in Jesus the Christ, and want their children baptized. Reverend Samuel Wakeman would hold his calling until his death in 1692, age 57. His will indicated an estate of about 1,000 pounds, considered quite large, especially as his wife was also well off. Mentioned in his will, 2 pounds to the poor, 10 shillings of it to a Thomas Jones, and Indiant, he referred to her as a servant, Jane, was to have 5 pounds and her liberty at age 26.
Thank you so much for that. So I don't usually do presentations like this. I usually select enslaved people from the town of Fairfield so I can tell a story that sort of encompasses the whole scope. So you're going to hear me say a number of times tonight that we don't have any information past this point about someone. Jane is not one of those people. So as was previously mentioned, Jane was an Indian servant who was bequeathed in the will of Samuel Wakeman to his wife. Now, what's unusual, though, about Jane was that there were certain provisions allowed here. For one, she was given 5 pounds. But secondly, she was to be freed at the age of 26, or in 1698. Samuel Wakeman made sure to write in his will that he did not know when she was born. And so whenever she became 26 years old, possibly in 1698, that is when she would be freed. In the meantime, she would have to serve Samuel Wakeman's widow, and if Samuel Wakeman's widow died, she would have to serve Samuel Wakeman's son. What I find so fascinating about Jane, though, she's the only native enslaved person that I'm going to talk about tonight. I believe that she actually has a connection to one of the most horrific conflicts that New England has been party to. If she was 26 in 1698, that means that she was born about 1672. In 1675, King Philip's War began, and it lasted until 1678. Now, it was a very, very complex conflict. All you have to know is that the English were fighting an allied group of Native Americans throughout New England, and it was horrifically bloody. Thousands of Native peoples of all nations were killed, but thousands more were taken hostage and sold into slavery. These were mostly women and children. And one of the primary buyers of these enslaved people were ministers, because they believed that Native peoples were not beyond saving, that if they just labored for the ministry, they could go to heaven as well. They could become good practicing Christians. And that would be that. They would have successfully colonized, settled, and Christianized the New World. Obviously, this typically wasn't really the case. And luckily for many of these enslaved native peoples, they were actually able to escape back to their home communities. But Jane is also representative of a larger concept, and that is this New England Caribbean circuit. While Jane was enslaved here in Fairfield, many native enslaved people were actually sent directly to the Caribbean to work on sugar and tobacco plantations, specifically Barbados and Jamaica. You might expect that in return for shipping enslaved native peoples to the Caribbean, they would receive money. This is not the case, though. In return, the people of New England were given enslaved Africans as payment. This is how the slavery of African Americans began in New England, through this loop. And I want to read to you a quote from a man named Emmanuel Downing. Downing was the brother-in-law of John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, the first governor of Massachusetts. And after the Pequot War, which ended here in Fairfield, he said the following: "A war with the Narragansett is very considerable to this plantation. If upon a just war the Lord should deliver them into our hands, we might easily have men, women, and children enough to exchange for Moors," Moors being enslaved Africans, "which will be more gainful pillage for us than we can conceive. For I do not see how we can thrive until we get into a stock of slaves sufficient to do all our business." This was the mindset of the early Puritan settlers. Which brings me to Samuel Wakeman's other enslaved person. He owned an unnamed Negro boy. Of course, I say unnamed because we don't have his name. He was, in fact, named. Unlike Jane, who was to be given her freedom at the age of 26, this child was given to Samuel Wakeman's wife in perpetuity. He was human chattel, and that was that. We can't really know what Samuel Wakeman was thinking, but we can get a good idea of how he thought about racial differences and about what slavery truly meant. And with that, I'll hand it off to our next presenter.
Hello. Reverend Joseph Webb was born in 1666 and grew up in Boston, attending Harvard College, from which he graduated in 1684. For the next 10 years, we only know that he, quote, engaged in secular pursuits, and that his youthful exuberance was toned down by several years of arduous and varied labors. I don't know what arduous and varied labors a Harvard graduate did, but he supposedly became a calm, sympathetic workman through this. As described by his biographer, Joseph Webb was of good cheer, hospitality, free of affectation, and was known as a man of rare abilities. He was erudite in grammar and skilled in rhetorical logic and theology. Webb accepted the call to the Fairfield pastorate and was ordained and installed in this our church in 1694, just 56 years after First Church Fairfield's founding. For the first 7 years as our pastor, he was a bachelor. He married Elizabeth Nichols of Stratford, still a familiar name today in that town, Nichols, in 1691. She passed away in 1718, and then he remarried 3 years later to an Elizabeth Cone, also of Stratford. He was not poor. In the historical record, a number of possessions were inventoried after Reverend Webb's death, which included items such as blue textiles, silver buttons, lots of glassware, and books, all of which were luxurious at the time. In fact, he owned a large library, which in those days was a very expensive accomplishment. Books were treasured possessions, rare for any but the wealthy, and literacy was not widespread among the general population of the time. He and his library played a symbolic and meaningful role in the founding of Yale College. Feeling a great need for an institution that would provide education for young men to become ministers in Connecticut. And to this purpose, Reverend Webb and 9 other ministers met in Branford in 1700. He placed some of his books, of his book collection on a table with the words, "I give these books for founding a college in this colony." He remained supportive and involved in the new Yale College for the remainder of his life. Reverend Webb was pastor of First Church until he died in 1732 while visiting friends in Stratford.
Thank you. This is the estate inventory of Joseph Webb, who died in 1732. If you're able to see the highlighted portion over there, you'll see that Phyllis, a Negro girl, was valued at 80 pounds and 10 shillings. She, like the rest of her property, had to be appraised. And they decided, when they were going through his estate, that Phyllis was worth this considerable amount of money. This speaks to the degree in which Phillips was able to perform valuable labor. But as was previously mentioned, I'm also interested in the things that are surrounding Phyllis. Coffee, tobacco, silver, sugar. These are all luxuries. And we can't help but think that perhaps part of this life of luxury was coming from the fact that he didn't have to do all of his work. He had someone to do it for him and never had to compensate them. But additionally, all of these things are the product of slave labor. Silver would have been mined in the mountains of Peru by enslaved native and black people. Sugar was obviously grown in the Caribbean by enslaved people on extensive plantations, as was tobacco. Coffee was also grown in South America by enslaved people. This inventory not only speaks to the fact that Joseph Webb owned enslaved humans, but that he was incredibly engaged in the international slave trade. He may not have been a trader in enslaved bodies himself, but he was profiting from others who were. For Phyllis's sake, she was living at a particularly bad time to be an enslaved person. Not that there was ever a good time, but this was pretty bad. In the early 1700s, in the North, there had been a series of slave rebellions, most notably in the city of New York, in Manhattan. A number of enslaved and free black people rose up, took up arms, and actually killed their enslavers. And there was something of a protracted battle that went on for several days. This kind of event took place in so many communities throughout the North and throughout the colonies generally. And slaveholders were understandably pretty concerned about this. So they started passing laws that are collectively known as the slave codes. Among these were restrictions on such things as movement and speech. Enslaved people here in the town of Fairfield were not allowed to be outside past 9 p.m. They were not allowed to gather in groups of more than 3 or 4 without the supervision of a white person. Enslaved people often had side trades. They made baskets, they cooked food. These laws put a limit on how much they could actually be patronized in that way. And lastly, enslaved people would also be punished brutally if they were found guilty of defaming a white person, saying anything that was in any way critical. They could face whipping, they could face jail time, and they could even face being sold out of the colony. Unfortunately, this is pretty much all we know about Phyllis and her lifetime in slavery, just this one record. That's all there is. Just her name and a price tag. And that's really sort of what I think you should take away about slavery in Connecticut and slavery more broadly. Slavery destroys humanity. We don't have any more information about this person's life because to the people who owned Phyllis, she was not a life, she was property. Next, Noah Hobart.
Hello. Hi, I'm Robin Dowling-Griscus, a member of the Working for Racial Justice Committee at this church. Noah Hobart was our fourth pastor of this church. He had an active, robust ministry spanning 40 years, from 1733 to 1773. He lived his life fully and with vigor, often, well, most Sundays, preaching 2 sermons. And with more than his customary animation, on the very last Sabbath of his life, he delivered his sermons. He was born in 1706 in Higham, Mass. He was the grandson of Higham's first pastor, the Reverend Peter Hobart. He graduated from Harvard in 1724, and he took some time off between the time that he was ordained and settled in Fairfield in 1773. Noah Hobart lived to bury 2 wives, 8 children, and 1,093 parishioners. So he was 3 times married, and his surviving wife, his third, Priscilla, she had been married before also. Noah Hobart was her 3rd husband, and she inherited his estate. Noah Hobart, our 4th pastor, was an owner of enslaved persons.
Thank you. The first person I want to talk to you about who was enslaved by Noah Hobart is a child named Dan. One of the most unusual things about slavery when it comes to enslaved people of ministers is the minister's willingness to actually baptize and perform religious rites for their enslaved people. On the one hand, they thought of them as property, but on the other, they recognized that there was a need to provide them with some sort of spiritual education. Unfortunately, this is the only record of Dan's existence. Just this one baptismal record from 1763. And that's it. We do have other records of Noah Hobart, but Dan's not there. Maybe Dan died, maybe Dan ran away, maybe Dan was sold. We simply don't know. But below him in the baptismal record is a second enslaved person who was baptized alongside him. And his name was Dolphin. You're probably thinking that's kind of a strange name for a human being, but there's actually some sense to it. Dolphin is probably a misreading of the name Dauphin, which is French for essentially a title, a royal title, usually prince. We don't really know how Dauphin got this name, but it's not really all that surprising when you consider the diversity of colonial America. We tend to forget this since we have been born, raised, and are currently living in a fairly homogeneous United States. Most people in the United States consider themselves Americans. This wasn't the case in colonial America. To our west, there would have been French settlements. To our south, in New York, there would have been Dutch, Jewish, Spanish people. This was an incredibly diverse community of people who had basically no connection to one another. They saw their homeland as being on the opposite side of the world. For Dauphin, perhaps this is where he comes from. This is the only French name we see among ministers, enslaved people. Maybe he had come up from the West Indies. France owned a considerable number of colonies there growing sugar, most notably Saint-Domingue, which you probably know as Haiti. Unfortunately, we just don't know. Now, Dauphin was given to Noah Hobart's wife, Priscilla. And while we don't see him after this point, after this 1773 will, we do have a good idea of what happened to him. Priscilla, after Noah Hobart died, decided to move back to Plymouth, Massachusetts, where she was originally from. I believe, personally, that Dauphin went with her. Dauphin was her legal property and was her bequest from her husband. It only makes sense that she took her legal property with her back to her hometown. They had one more enslaved person, though, and his name was Tony, also a child, and also willed to one of Noah Hobart's family members. Tony, however, was willed to Noah's stepdaughter, Priscilla Burr. Priscilla Burr was the wife of a man named Gershom Burr, who was a very large-scale farmer and trader here in the town of Fairfield. And I've been able to trace Tony a little bit more thoroughly than I have been some of these other individuals. Here we see Tony appear once again in 1789, 16 years after that original will. And here he's being itemized in an inventory along with a hog, a mare, oxen, cow, and another enslaved woman named Dorcas. While we had his baptism record just a few seconds ago, him being recognized as a human being, here we have him being recognized as barely any more valuable than livestock. This is the strange sort of confusion that was going through the minds of enslavers. On the one hand, they were property. On the other, they were people. You'll see this come up over and over again in the history of slavery. It doesn't go away. Because at the heart of it, slaveholders knew that what they were doing was itemizing human beings. After this date, once again, we completely lose this enslaved person. Tony disappears from the record.
Hello, I'm Todd Sample, and I have Andrew Elliott. So Andrew Elliott was born in Boston in 1743. In 1774, he was ordained as the 5th pastor of First Church. In the same year, he was married to Mary Pynchon back in Cambridge in Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were parents of 1 son and 6 daughters here in Fairfield. Pastor Elliott was pastor of First Church when it was attacked in 1779 by the British, where most buildings in Fairfield were burned, including this church. He served God and the people of Fairfield until 1805, when he was arrested in his 63rd year after 32 years of ministry. Andrew Elliott comes from a very elite family in Boston, part of what's called the Boston Brahmin. The first Elliott, Andrew Elliott, he's the 5th Andrew of the family. The first was Andrew Elliott from Somerset and settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony as a shoemaker. His father was a prominent minister in Boston and one of the few ministers who remained after the siege of the American Revolutionary War. Our pastor, Andrew Elliott, graduated from Harvard in 1762. Thought this bit was a little interesting. He served as a librarian where he lost all of his belongings when the old college building was burned in 1764. Maybe he was preparing for his calling here in Fairfield. The Elliott family were elites. As I mentioned, they were part of the Boston Brahmin, influential group that formed the early economic and political base of New England, much of what Alec is addressing here today. A couple of other Elliots that you may know of is Charles Eliot, who served as president of Harvard and was famously envied by Teddy Roosevelt. T.S. Eliot, the poet. Also, Dr. Martha May Eliot, born 1891 and died in 1978. Dr. Martha May Eliot was a pediatrician, public health director at the WHO, an architect of the New Deal, and a quiet, radical lesbian and partner to Ethel Dunham, who was also a pioneering female pediatrician. That's Andrew Elliott.
Thank you. Before I talk about the people who were enslaved by Andrew Elliott, I want to talk about the momentous shift in slavery in Connecticut and in the North more broadly that was going on at this time. As Todd just mentioned, the revolution was happening during Andrew Elliott's pastorage here. And the revolution was particularly important for enslaved people because for them, it truly meant freedom, but not for the reasons you may think. The revolution is considered one of the largest slave rebellions in history. Tens of thousands of people, enslaved by Americans and British alike, fled their owners during this conflict. Most of them fled to the British. The British, despite being for taxation without representation and all sorts of these other things that we as Americans have grown to dislike, they were offering freedom to enslaved people who defected from American patriots and joined the British forces, helped them in some way. Between 10 and 15,000 enslaved people joined with British troops and were relocated in Nova Scotia. Slaveholders of the Americas were pretty upset about this. This was their property, fleeing them, and then helping their enemies to defeat them. They decided, collectively and in spurts, that they had to do something to address this problem. And so they started coming up with ways to appease these enslaved people who were now hearing more and more about this concept of freedom that wasn't applying to them. And that's where we get the gradual emancipation movement, the gradual abolition movement. In 1783, just a few months after the end of the American Revolution, Connecticut passed the Gradual Abolition Act. Now, what that stated was that after March 1st, 1784, any female born into slavery after that date must be freed at the age of 21. Any male born into slavery after that date must be freed at the age of 25. People have often characterized this as indentured servitude, but it's not. They were not entitled to anything beyond their own bodies after they were freed. You'll also often hear that Connecticut abolished slavery in 1784. This is an outright falsehood. Slavery would exist for another 64 years. But this act was very consequential in some other ways. For one, It didn't help anyone who was born before March 1st, 1784. They could be enslaved for the rest of their lives, and many were. Additionally, there were all sorts of loopholes involved in this, and slaveholders took the opportunity to either sell their enslaved people to other colonies which didn't have gradual emancipation acts, or to put them into leasing contracts, which would take precedence over this act. So if an enslaved person was being leased out to another resident of the town of Fairfield, it didn't really matter if they turned 21 or 25. They were the legal property of a slaveholder, and they were compelled to fulfill that lease agreement. The people that I'm about to talk to you about, though, the family that I'm about to inform you of, none of these rules applied to them. They were born before gradual emancipation, and they were never entitled to freedom. The first person in Andrew Elliott's household that I would like to talk about is a woman named Nanny. Nanny was an enslaved black woman who was married to a man named Tony. Again, you'll see that name come up very, very frequently. Married to a man named Tony, who was enslaved by a man named Jeremiah Sherwood, who lived in Greens Farms. For us, that may seem like not such a huge distance, but in 1775, with terrible roads, not that we have any better roads now, with terrible roads and no source of transportation for an enslaved person, this might as well have been the other end of the earth. I see no reason to think that Nanny and Tony saw each other besides a few times a week, maybe only once, maybe not even once. Enslaved people were typically given one day of leisure a week, and that was Sunday. I tend to think that Andrew Elliott had other things going on Sundays, that he might have needed extra labor. It would be hard to imagine a day where Nanny and Tony could actually be together, just together. And that's really one of the main things about slavery that is so grotesque, is that people were separated from the ones they loved over and over and over again. For what it's worth, Nanny and Tony were able to be together, at least to some degree, and they would have 3 children. Their oldest was also named Tony, and he was born in 1770. I wish I could tell you more about him, but that's pretty much it. That's all we know. And the same goes for their youngest, Flora. Flora was born in 1776, just a few weeks before the Declaration of Independence declared that all men were created equal. She would never see the end of slavery. But this is it. This is it. That's all I can say about them. But they had another sibling who I can say much, much more about, and I'm very excited to talk about. The middle child was named Anna. Anna, who later would go by the name Nancy, was like any other enslaved child of a minister. She was likely taking care of domestic duties, washing dishes, cleaning clothing, helping mend clothing, fetching water from wells, all sorts of things like that. At some point, Nancy wound up in the home of a man named Hezekiah Bradley, who lived in Greenfield Hill. Once again, you see this family is being picked apart. I don't know why she wound up there. Maybe she was sold. Maybe something else happened. Andrew Elliott may have had a need to sell enslaved people, though, given the fact that his house burned down and he lost so much of his property here in Fairfield when the British burned the town in 1779. Perhaps. Regardless, Nancy was separated now from both her father, her mother, and her siblings. But the story gets worse. Hezekiah getting ahead of myself. Hezekiah Bradley had a daughter named Charlotte. And Charlotte was getting married to another man, get this, Hezekiah Chafee. A lot of Hezekiahs in this story. And of course, with any wedding, there are presents. And Nancy became that wedding present. In 1785, Nancy was just 11 years old, and she was made the wedding present for Charlotte and Hezekiah Chafee. Hezekiah Chafee, however, was not from Fairfield. He was from Windsor, Connecticut, and Nancy was soon shipped all the way across the state. As you can see, the distance that was put between Nancy and her family is pretty much insurmountable. It's hard to imagine any circumstance in which Nancy ever saw her family again. That was probably it. Nancy worked in the home of Hezekiah Chafee and his wife Charlotte for the next 36 years without payment. In 1821, Hezekiah Chafee died. 1821. Nancy was still enslaved, despite the fact that 2 generations of people had been born into slavery and freed by the Gradual Emancipation Act. And she was then given to another family. Hezekiah Chafee then gave Nancy to his daughter, Abigail. Abigail was married to a man named James Loomis. James Loomis was a farmer and a veteran, and that's, again, pretty much the end of the story. But there is something unusual here. Now, if you're from Connecticut, the names Loomis and Chafee probably ring a bell. This is the family that founded the Loomis-Chafee boarding school. And they owned Nancy for as long as she lived. Now, 1821 is the last record that we have of Nancy definitively enslaved. In the 1830 United States Census, she's listed as a free person. However, there has never been a record of emancipation found, ever. This is kind of strange, since emancipation documents should have been kept at the town clerk's office. These are government records. So if it's not there, it's probably not anywhere. There's really no reason to suspect that Nancy was freed, despite what some want to believe. And so we have no way of knowing what those years really looked like for Nancy. We have to believe that Nancy remained in slavery until Connecticut abolished it entirely in 1848. She was born in 1774, before this country even existed. Now, just 13 years before the Civil War, she was finally a free person. No one wants to be the last slaveholder in Connecticut. And there is quite a bit of resistance about this story. People who are insistent that no, she was a free woman, that she was treated like one of the family. There's no evidence to support this. We can't change this history. We can only address it head on. For my part, I am so grateful that we have the story of Nancy, specifically because she lived this incredible and long life. Nancy died in 1857, meaning that she was alive for the invention of the camera. Nancy, who took the last name Tony in homage to her father, is the only known enslaved person from the town of Fairfield for whom there is a photograph. This photograph is owned by the Loomis Chaffee School because they owned her. And that is where I'll leave it today.
Thank you very much, Alec. We have a few minutes for questions, if we have any questions that you'd like to pose to Alec. I wanted to mention that one of our plans as a church is on Juneteenth, we'll have a celebration out in front of the church where we're going to dedicate memorials to these 10 enslaved people that were owned by ministers here. And they'll be placed in our memorial garden, the plaques. So I wanted to mention that. But any questions for Alec? Yes.
Jim. Just wondering if that fire destroyed some of these records that you've been researching so carefully.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, the problem with fires is that we don't really know what isn't here. And that's really an issue with the work of history, right? We can only deal with the records that we have present. There are probably thousands of records of enslaved people in the town of Fairfield that we just don't know about. You know, this work has been able to identify at least 1,000 enslaved people. I would guess that there were probably hundreds more. The records, though, just haven't made themselves available.
It's helpful, I know, to focus on just a few people, and the fact that you focused for this presentation on ministers of this congregation makes sense. I imagine that of those thousands of enslaved people, many of them were owned by members of this congregation as well, and I'm wondering what kind of research has been done on that, to that respect.
Yeah, thank you. So, yes, and there's a particular, I've been thinking a bit about this and thinking about the various deacons of the church, because obviously they played a very important role. And we know for a fact that many of them did, in fact, own slaves. But I've never really done something like this before, where I specifically hone in on a particular line of work. So this is really the first time that I've looked specifically at the ministers. And I'm doing that pretty much just to keep a focused way of looking at slavery so that we can represent the thousands. These 10 are by no means the end of this population. It's just a good start.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you have some, if you think there are some implications from this, given your extensive work with wills and the emphasis on the economic advantages to white people for slavery. Do you have some implications from this for reparations?
Yes, actually, that's a great question. So currently I'm doing research on an enslaved family from Fairfield who seemingly did receive reparations in some sense. The woman who enslaved this family decided to liquidate her entire estate and give it to her enslaved people. I had initially thought that this is an interesting example of how maybe reparations could actually work. What I found was quite the opposite, actually, and I found that throughout the 1800s and even into the 1900s, the fact that a black family was able to amass property actually made them a target going forward. And you see that they are threatened with imprisonment and fines and all sorts of horrible indignities simply for getting this sum of money that was due to them. I can't really speak to what the impact would be today. It's impossible to say. We don't really know. I know that the sum of money that would have to be doled out would be inconceivable.
Alec, I just wanted to know if you could speak with Nancy Tony today, what would you say to her?
You know, that's a really great question. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to know the truth of her story and her experiences in the Chafee and Loomis households. You know, it's really easy to twist history to fit your own agenda. And the only people who can put this to rest are long gone. And that's really what I would want to know. She knows the truth, but she's not here to tell us.
I'm not asking for your opinion, but is there any movement in the state to get rid of some of these names? Like all of these famous names that we know?
Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I know that some universities in the state have done this. Yale University in particular has been taking a really hard look at who their colleges and dormitories are named after. But otherwise, I don't really know. And, you know, it's important to actually think a little bit more broadly about this because Yale is, you know, one of the oldest schools is the oldest school in the state of Connecticut. But you also have newer schools here who have buildings and programs named after people who enslaved people elsewhere. So, for instance, at Fairfield University, you have buildings named after Jesuits. The Jesuits were running a slave trading ring. That's how the Georgetown University was founded. So if we want to start looking into how we name certain things, schools and hospitals and public places, we're going to need to think very expansively about this and think about everyone who was harmed, whether it happened in the state or elsewhere.
I was wondering, where did they live? Were they in the main house with the slaves? Did they live in the main house with those people, or were they in the barn, or how did they?
Yes.
Did they have separate cottages? I mean, I know what it looks like online from the south, but I didn't know what they did here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the most part, enslaved people were typically living in attic spaces and cellars, and sometimes even sleeping in doorways. When you had 1 to 2 enslaved people in a household, it didn't make sense for the slaveholder to actually construct a separate dwelling house for someone that they had no respect for at all. And particularly for female enslaved people, they had to be kept close, because if they were in charge of raising children, especially small children, they had to be on call all the time. If a baby started crying, they had to be ready to rush into that room and attend to its needs. There are a few examples of separate slave quarters here in the state of Connecticut. The Bush Holly House in Greenwich actually had one. And so did the Silliman estate that I mentioned earlier, Holland Hill. There is actually a photograph of that slave quarters, which was taken by Mabel Osgood Wright, a famous photographer and naturalist here in the town of Fairfield. As far as I know, that building that was the slave quarters has been converted into a residence.
I'm following up on that question back here. Is there any indication how the enslaved people were treated? Was it similar to the people in the South, you mentioned the shackles, just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, I have no reason to think that it was any less severe than it was elsewhere. You know, I mentioned before the story of this 14-year-old boy who was whipped and sold to the West Indies. He's not the only person that was whipped. He's not the only person that was beaten. And there are dozens of records of enslaved people running away from slaveholders in the town of Fairfield. One of whom that I constantly think about actually had a 16-month-old child and was pregnant, 9 months pregnant with another. She decided to run away. We can't know what was going on in the household where she was working, but we can assume that it probably wasn't anything good. I have no reason to believe that enslavers here in Connecticut in the North were any more gentle than they were elsewhere.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I was wondering if you knew anything about where enslaved people were buried in the town of Fairfield, and in particular, there's a cemetery on this street called East Cemetery, and there's a marker of a man, and it says, "Faithfully served 4 generations." And I wondered if you knew anything about that topic.
Yeah, and I actually know something specifically about that headstone. So that is the headstone of a man named James Moore. And he was not enslaved here in Connecticut, but he was very likely enslaved in the South. He was a paid servant to the Turney family, which was a very wealthy family that lived over on, I believe, Beach and Old Post Road. And he served that family for decades. I believe, having looked at the census records that speak about him, that he probably ran away from slavery sometime in the 1850s and lived here for the rest of his life. I don't believe he chose that headstone. In East Cemetery, however, there is a strip of green along the eastern side. You'll see one headstone that says Serena Freeman. You'll see a whole bunch of other headstones, none of which are in very good shape. And this was the colored section of the cemetery. We also know that Fairfield West Cemetery had a specific section in the back that was specifically labeled the colored section, in which strangers and servants were to be buried. And then in the old burying ground, there is a patch, perfect patch, in the back right-hand corner. There are no headstones at all. Now, the Fairfield Museum actually did LiDAR surveys, which use laser to actually penetrate the ground, and there are bodies there. There were burials, despite the fact that there were no headstones. That's very indicative of enslaved people and people who were not associated with a church. So they were certainly buried here. Perhaps some of them were buried on personal properties, but I tend to believe that many of them were buried in the cemeteries in unmarked patches.
In your research, have you been able to identify any slave traders who lived in Fairfield?
Yeah, that's a harder question because it's difficult to say when someone is truly a slave trader. If they purchase one enslaved person and sell one enslaved person, does that make them a slave trader? What's the threshold? I do believe there's one person who may have been a slave trader who I've seen evidence purchased and sold between 5 and 6 people. His name was Gershom Bradley. But I've never been able to actually confirm that, unfortunately. I would like to. Now, I do know that there was a considerable amount of slave trading going on in New London County and in Rhode Island. Basically, anywhere you had really deep harbors and ports, is where you would get a concentration of slave traders. So Fairfield, probably not a mecca for slave traders, but definitely for slave owners.
Thank you so much, Alec. I'm going to invite everyone. We have a reception in the back. Alec will be joining us if you'd like to ask him questions directly. And thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you being here.